A game's art is probably the most important thing to a game's quality to me. Something with a cool ass art style that just gives you that feeling. When I say game art, I'm speaking more about the graphics of a game. What makes this game look and feel unique? The art direction. In the current gaming landscape, there's a bit of an obsession with overly realistic graphics. Not to say that realistic graphics can't have that effect, but I'll stand on business and say that they are distinctly two different feelings. For the longest time, I've wanted to be an illustrator, and while I ultimately had to give that up, I still have the mind of a weirdo art appreciator that I once was. It's so bad that a game's art style alone is enough to gauge my interest instantly. Which is also bad because these games that have my favorite styles don't always deliver on both fronts. So today I'm going to nerd out about some aesthetically pleasing bullshit that I love. The first one is very specifically low poly, or what everyone else likes to call them nowadays, PS1 graphics. Low poly graphics are pretty self-explanatory. The objects and characters that were rendered with a low polygon count. Mostly because that was the technical limitations of the consoles back then. Recently though, there's been a resurgence of these demakes and insert game here, but PS1 graphics. They're satisfying to the eye because our brain likes to work. It works by letting the imagination take over, filling in the gaps that these triangle-shaped boobs couldn't fill. That could be why games back in the day had a stronger effect on your mind. And I don't mean the nostalgia of that era in particular. There's just something so warming about the atmosphere of a game like this, for example. Pseudo Regalia is an indie 3D platformer Metroidvania with tinges of the gameplay of Mario 64. Playing it felt like traveling back in time to old games on the N64. And that's not why this speaks to me though. It's moments like these why I love this game. I just don't think the game would have hit the same if it didn't have that Nintendo 64 aesthetic. There's not many modern games that have replicated this feeling this game gives me. In terms of vibes, the only series I could really compare it to is classic Zelda. This suspenseful dreaminess layered together with something very unsettling. But the difference here is that this fucking game here has some movement that literally anyone can master. Then at the very end, you get slammed with a very touching bit of food for thought. Next game. Jet Set Radio! Jet Set Radio is a Dreamcast game that came out in the year 2000, and I absolutely love everything about it. From the vibes to the music, the style, even the way it sounds. All that shit just screams to me. While researching for the video, I found out that it's considered predominantly a Y2K aesthetic, known by different names like Cybercore, Cyber Y2K, and fucking apparently K-Bug. What the fuck is a K-Bug? Basically, it's that early 2000s vibe with the old Windows 95 and XP visuals and all that bullshit. I almost made a video on this game, but I loved everything except the gameplay. The controls are so damn floaty, yet somehow manages to be precise yet stiff at the same time. Like it's actually really tough trying to explain this feeling. It's especially bad when you're tagging graffiti. Don't even get me started on that. Which is why you could probably believe that I was so hyped to see Team Reptile whip up a spiritual successor to those games with Bomb Rush Cyberpunk. It embodies everything that is cool about Jet Set Radio, and it controls amazingly. Side tangent, it's not surprising that indie developers are the only ones getting real experimental with art styles. That style of game doesn't really have the widest appeal that these large companies are looking for. If the many examples of toxic positivity in the industry is anything to go by, executives don't like hearing that something that was their idea looks like shit. I feel like there's a reason why the Concord designs look so fucking stupid. They didn't have the guy in the studio to be like, hey, this guy looks like a jackass. We need more passes on this design. Like, it does not look appealing at all. That's a game that would have benefited the most by having a more stylized art direction instead of this weird, uncanny valley fucking realism, which succeeds at nothing while trying to do both at the same time. I think the way you succeed at achieving that style is the Like a Dragon series. That game looks somewhat realistic, but having some of the goofiest shit you'll ever see in a video game. Imagine your reaction if they took the sequels to God of War or Spider-Man on PS4 and kind of like pivoted, right? And pivoted back to a more stylized, cartoony version of those characters, because that's kind of what they originally looked like. That's the problem with what I'm talking about, is when you have these like ultra realistic, these giga graphics, you kind of set the bar extremely high in your own mind, assuming like, oh my god, like, that shit looks like PS2 graphics. I feel like anyone who has called something PS2 graphics have never actually played a PS2 game. Like, have they ever seen Silent Hill 3 on the PS2? Like, that shit barely looks like you wouldn't even think it was made for the PS2. Anyway, tangent over, you can go back to the normal video. Dread Delusion was a game that looked perfectly made for someone like me, who is very artistically anal about art design. It's an action-adventure RPG that takes heavy inspiration from Morrowind, with a huge interconnected map with a ridiculous draw distance, similar to like Breath of the Wild and Elden Ring, where they tease you with large, interesting areas that you can go to, that you can see in the background, enticing you to explore this like giant-ass, vaporwave-looking fantasy world. Unlike most PS1 style graphics, they fully understand how these systems worked to achieve that look, with so many uncanny and nightmare fuel level creatures and character designs. It's truly a beautiful game. The way it fuses its colors and set pieces give it such a unique identity that's hard to forget. And surprisingly, the narrative is quite deep for an indie game of this level. Only real negative I have about this game is its rudimentary combat. Morrowind, while being simple, had a very weird amount of complexity to it. Dread Delusion, on the other hand, just doesn't seem to have that. It's a spammy action-adventure game with some unexpectedly dense writing in a beautiful world to explore. Before I get to the pixel art chapter of the video, I have two honorable mentions of like some cool ass PS1 games that I didn't really get time to research on. Vagrant Story and Space Channel 5. Vagrant Story was a classic JRPG made by Squaresoft on the PS1 before they merged with Enix. I know nothing of the game other than the mood and the setting. The game's art looks magnificently crafted, from the designs and how they even mixed like different art styles to create like some artificial lighting in all these scenes. Not many action games focus on the Victorian era without kind of like blending it together with like three other things, so it kind of drowns out the nature of what that era looked like. Maybe I'll play it one day and make a video on it. I'm still debating that, but I want to talk about Space Channel 5, obviously for its art direction, but mainly because it was made by Sega. At least at the time it came out, Sega was the only AAA developer that was willing to take risks on games that had varied art styles. The Dreamcast was home to many of these very experimental type of games. So of course when that console died, a lot of that push and the motivation for that type of game fizzled out. GameCube kind of resurged that need a little bit, but I think that was mainly because of Capcom. Anyway, this game fucking looks cool. Its music probably goes fucking hard as shit, and it looks very similar to the vibes of like Jet Set Radio, which, as you heard earlier, I adore that game. Pixel art is a style that I think needs no introduction. It was the beginning of video games. It's what games looked like from their first inception. Early video game development had a lot of restrictions when it came to resolutions and color palettes because the hardware at the time was that limited. The SNES, for example, had fucking 8 like graphic modes or something just to help alleviate some of the limitations on color. Now it's kind of evolved into a artistic choice. It feels like it was forcefully given this stigma to be like made for indie projects because the industry has largely abandoned it. Obviously from both sides, consumers and the developers themselves. That's what this video was originally going to be about how underutilized pixel art is. But that's okay, pixel art, because I have not forgotten about you.
Shake my guilt once again.
First one is Blasphemous. This game has some of the best looking pixel art animation I've seen in a long ass time. It's a Souls-like-esque platformer based on symbolic Catholicism with a little bit of dark fantasy thrown in. I'm not sure why this game pulls so much intrigue like looks out of me. I think it's the same type of interest that comes from the Souls games, that attractive somber of the world kind of singing to you with all these beautifully ugly enemy and boss designs that all depict this desperate faith everyone in this world seems to have. The major difference with Blasphemous though is the highly detailed pixelated cutscenes. I don't actually remember caring for the gameplay in particular, but it was serviceably good from the little bit that I played. Like, just imagine being someone who's pretty much a gameplay gamer going into this game purely for the art style and the gameplay being the last thing that you actually fucking care about. But if we're gonna talk about gameplay that I actually did care for, it was Loop Hero. Loop Hero is one of those games that feels like returning to the past, channeling the energy of those really good, obscure-looking PS2 games. It's a deck-building roguelike with another cool-looking dark fantasy world. The premise is that a lich has thrown the world into a timeless loop, so you loop around the map endlessly until you get to the point where you can fight the loop's chapter boss, getting progressively more difficult the further you get through the loops. The art looks sick, the music bangs, and the gameplay is so fucking addictive. You might have guessed it, but this game, nice aesthetic. I feel like that there is not much I have to say about this game, especially because it's a game I haven't played. It's a style that has had a massive influence on indie games since it came out all the way back in 2011. While it's unconfirmed, the developer has talked a lot about how Hotline Miami 1 might have influenced a lot of games, even some AAA ones like The Last of Us Part 2. He says that indies usually inspire other indies, but not often do you see it in AAA games. It seems like they might have took inspiration with its level design. I guess I would be praising its aesthetic in that case rather than the art direction itself, I guess. World of Horror is so extremely weird for me to talk about because I can't tell anything of what the fuck's going on here. I've known about this game for a really long time. It's supposed to be like a Lovecraftian roguelike point and click RPG card game. What lured me in initially is this like weird ass Junji Ito art style mixed with really well drawn pixel art. It's probably the perfect middle ground between drawn art and pixel art for that specific psychological horror genre. From the backgrounds to the interface, the characters, the monstrosities, plus the fucking body horror, the game is just so interesting to look at. There's little details all over the screen throughout the gameplay. It's honestly a bit too much at times, but if we're talking about artistically, it tingles a lot of the different places in my mind that I enjoy, so I ultimately don't really care. And that means that I may not ever play this game, but I can really feel the vision of this game speaking to my soul. There's obviously other games that have incredible art that I didn't necessarily talk about, so we'll do like some honorable mentions of games with some pretty cool art. Symphony of the Night, Persona, Okami, any game by the guys who made Journey, like Flower and stuff like that. From Software in general, Faith, There's one game that has a Silent Hill composer. I think it's Decarnation. It's called Decarnation. Fucking Pizza Tower, man. I cannot stop thinking about or listening to Pizza Tower music. You guys can comment down below like what game art style is your favorite and why. It'd be very interesting to hear some sleepers you guys might know. And as a final note, I feel like there is a difference between bad graphics and something that's very clearly intentionally stylized. Alright, I'm done yapping. See ya.
Chameleon machine, chameleon machine, chameleon, chameleon. Let 'em know. Chameleon machine.